Okay, our next session, we'll be looking at the various applications in healthcare for AR/VR technologies. Our moderator is Dr. Blake Murphy. He is a plastic and reconstructive surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital and an affiliated faculty of Techna. More importantly, he's been working on with us to build this agenda. So I'd like to give it to you, Blake.
All right, thank you, Tracy. So we'll start this panel with Justin Sutherland, who's a medical physicist and associate professor at the Ottawa Hospital, and he'll be giving a talk on radiology applications and virtual reality and imaging. Justin?
Thank you. So thanks for sticking around after lunch. Hopefully not everyone's sleepy from eating. So I'll be talking about vision for virtual reality as the next stage for interfacing with medical images, and then how that might work and the things that we might need to worry about for that. Just a quick disclosure, I'm a co-founder of a medical VR startup. Okay, so VR as a platform for medical image interface. There's a few reasons why this might be a good idea. First, it allows for true 3D visualization. Through the use of tracked controllers or hands, we can have multi-dimensional input, which can increase our ways that we can interact with these images. And then, like Albert mentioned this morning, you can have networked and remote interactions that create a very valuable tool for communication and learning and things like that. So we have a vision of virtual reality and associated technologies being the next stage for how we interact with medical images. So we used to look at images as films on light boards. Then we went to computer monitors, and that created these interactions that we're kind of unaware of now because they're so commonplace, but just things like scrolling through images would have been a big deal back then. So what kind of things are available for that in terms of virtual reality, and how can we reimagine things as if we were starting from scratch? So just because I'm starting the session, I'll give a brief overview of the technology and introduce some concepts that will help you understand the different implementations of VR and AR. So these technologies are delineated by three broad technologies, which is either the implementation of them or whether they're there or not. So the first is visualization. So you can imagine how that might distinguish AR and VR applications. Augmented reality, you see mostly the real world with superimposed virtual elements. And then in virtual reality, you're immersed in a fully virtual environment that encompasses your entire field of view. And then you have applications like an iPad that has augmented reality there, but then you're seeing the camera's field of view. So the second technology is tracking technology, primarily tracking the user's head or eyes, and using that we can display the image that they would be seeing in a virtual environment or displaying virtual elements to them. And finally, there's another distinguishing technology, which is the ability for structure sensing. So seeing things that are objects in the real world and then potentially working with those in the environment. So just to go over that, there's the concept of virtuality, which is the amount of virtual elements that you see in a given scene. And this is implemented by visualization technology. You then get the concept of perspective generalization, which is enabled by tracking technology. So perspective generalization is the ability of a virtual element to have a fixed position in space, and then you have your own perspective of it, versus it being fixed to your point of view, like a heads-up display. And then finally, the concept of world cognizance. So that's having the simulation that you're experiencing, take advantage of knowing where things are in the world, and then having virtual elements interact with them. And so that's enabled by structure sensing technology. So just a low implementation of virtual reality would be the user sees entirely the real world. High would be the user sees entirely a virtual world, so virtual reality at the high end. And that's not a comment on the sophistication of the technology, that's just the different ways to implement it. Perspective generalization, you can have a fixed perspective where something is locked to your head, you move your head and it moves with you, versus a fully generalized perspective where you have an object that inhabits a position in space, and then you or I can have our own individual perspective of it and move around it. And then finally, world cognizance, there's no interaction or where it's agnostic, and then fully world cognizant, you have virtual objects interact with real objects. So this kind of makes a three-dimensional grid on which you can place all the different implementations of the technology. And I'll go through them quickly just to get a sense of how you can use these different concepts to understand how these things are implemented. So Google Glass would be on the bottom left there. It's low in virtuality, so it mostly displays the real environment. It has very little perspective generalization because it's fixed to your point of view. There's no real simulation of something that you're moving around. And then it also doesn't really use world cognizance, so there's no interaction with the real world. The Oculus Go is an early version of a mobile headset from Oculus, and it has 3 degrees of freedom in motion. So you can simulate moving your head around in terms of angle, but as soon as you move back and forth, it doesn't simulate that. So that's why it's fully virtual, but has basically average or midway perspective generalization, and then no world cognizance, which makes sense, you're in a fully virtual environment. So then you think of augmented reality applications like the Apple AR Kit. That you could say has basically midway virtual reality. You're displaying virtual elements superimposed on the real world. It has world cognizance, so you can have little guys running on tables and things like that, so it knows what's there in the world. But then it doesn't have a lot of perspective generalization. You're seeing a general perspective, but it's the perspective of the camera, not your own. And so that distinguishes it from something like the HoloLens, where you have your own particular perspective that you get to see of things. And so you can have objects that are fully generalized in terms of how you can look around them. Okay, so let's get back to radiological images. There's a few different ways that those can be visualized in a fully realized virtual environment. The most common one is segmented mesh models. And this sees a lot of focus in terms of VR applications, largely due to the fact that we already have robust 3D printing programs for surgical planning in the field of radiology. And so it's a very easy jump to take those models that we were printing and then just put them in a virtual environment to interact with. But one of the exciting things that VR can afford is the ability to look at unsegmented image data in different ways. The most boring is simply just recreating the 2D visualizations that we do today, so just basically having a virtual monitor in the scene. But then you can increase the ability to interact with things in a 3-dimensional way. So the first is one we call 2.5D visualization. And in this case, you have a sampling plane that's interacting with a 3D volume. And it seems like a bit of a trivial distinction to make, but it actually has some really interesting results. So having this plane in 3D space means that it actually has a physical representation in terms of its geometry. And so you can have some embodied understanding of what it is that you're doing with the image and how you're interacting with it. And then finally, a full 3D visualization would just be volume rendering, where you cast rays through an object and then you create a 3D representation of the underlying image data. So there's some interesting things to think about when you talk about visualization quality and how to ensure that in a virtual environment. So with a traditional display, you have the ambient light conditions that are affecting your ability to see what's on the screen, but primarily it's the display resolution and underlying characteristics like uniformity and contrast that affect your ability to see what you're looking at. This kind of falls apart when you look at images in a fully realized virtual environment that you're simulating, and I'll try and go through it a bit here. It's a bit complicated. So imagine you have everything existing in this virtual environment that's created by software. You can think of this as a software layer. So there's a virtual scene around you, and then that has basically parts of the scene that will be displayed on a panel. Typically in virtual headsets or virtual reality headsets, they do something called an inverse lens distortion, where you pre-distort the image for the lenses to further then put it back to your eyes, but then have a larger field of view. There's other things that can go into this software layer that can affect image quality, like the choice of anti-aliasing and things like that. So the panel has its own display characteristics, just like in a conventional paradigm, but then the light goes through a lens before it hits your eye, and so there's results of that. So you can have bleeding artifacts from the particular lens construction, you can have errors in the lens that basically has rays of light go in places that they're not supposed to be. And then finally you have a last layer, which would be the layer where your eyes interact with the headset and the physical characteristics of having it on your head. So if you have a gap between your nose and the headset, there can be external light that can enter the scene, and then that can reduce your ability to resolve low contrast objects. So we've come up with a formalism that we're working on to help us better understand and quantify the visualization quality of virtual environments. And primarily it comes down to 2 main characteristics. One is the ability to resolve an angular resolution. So because it's pixels on a screen that are creating a virtual environment, it's basically the angle between each 2 pixels in relation to your eye. And then there's the resolvable field of view. So the quality of the image degrades as you go off your center line. And so if you can measure those 2 things with an application that you make, then you can basically create a known position in space where you can see an image with good enough fidelity. And so there's kind of an example of that where you have an image in 2 orientations with respect to the person's eye. And so those will create different angles that are on the eye and then angles off of center line. So if you're far off on the edge of the headset and then you also have something that's very high resolution, you probably won't be able to see it. But if you construct an application appropriately, you can ensure that you'll be able to see it with a good enough diagnostic quality. And you can actually display that to the user. So on the image, you could have a color-coded overlay that says this is something that you shouldn't be looking at because you're not going to be able to resolve it with the degree that the scanner was able to acquire it. So we've done, I won't really go into the results because they're not all that interesting, but we've done measurements with this, and you are able to distinguish the different characteristics for the different headsets in terms of how you should be looking at these images. So there's some interesting things how the angular resolution depends on how bright the scene is, and that has to do with those lens effects that I was talking about before. So if you have a lot of brightness in the scene, then you're creating these stray rays of light that affect your ability to resolve things. And then you can also have differences in resolvable contrast at different places in the screen for that same effect when you go to brighter and brighter scenes. And then this is just an explanation, like showing how your ability to resolve things decreases as you go off the center line in terms of angle. Okay, so let's get to some more interesting things. So this is changing our the way that we actually interface with images. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the conventional paradigm that we're all used to, which is you acquire a scan, and that scan is a stack of slices, and then you look at that on a 2D monitor. So there's some inherent things that create constraints with this type of platform. One is that it's very difficult to get off plane. So we're very used to the three anatomical axes that we deal with, so coronal, sagittal, that kind of thing. And we spend a great deal of time training ourselves to look at images that way, to understand things, because inherently what you're doing is you're creating a mental model in your head of the underlying representation of the patient by looking at slices of the image. And the reason, one of the main reasons that we don't use oblique angles when we look at images is because the moment you do that kind of transformation in a 2D paradigm, you lose your sense of orientation of what it is that you're looking at. We do some oblique angles, but they're tied to very specific landmarks, and you actually have to have specific training to understand what you're looking at. So that means that when we input data, so if we're ever doing any kind of delineation or model creation, we're sticking with these planes, and they may not be the best way to describe the patient. So if you imagine you're trying to describe a car engine to someone and how all the pieces fit together, and you could only look at it slice by slice in the axial plane, it would be almost impossible to diagnose something that's wrong with the patient and that kind of thing. So we've come up with a modeling platform, and the reason why we're focusing on modeling is largely because it's the biggest win for the 3D visualization. So how can we use radiological images in these new ways to create new models for surgeons to use and things like that, trying to bring the benefit of virtual reality to the first person looking at the images rather than the people downstream like surgeons. So I'm running out of time here. I'll just get into some interesting videos. So this is different ways to navigate an image using these concepts. So we have a 2.5D visualization plane that's intersecting with an image. There's a 3D volume rendering that's guiding you in terms of your orientation with that image. And then you can use intuitive hand gestures to basically find any display of that image that shows exactly what it is that you're looking for. You can also navigate to the conventional orientations. And then we created this interesting concept of an anchor point where you want to see a different view of a particular piece of anatomy, so you actually hold it in place with a stylus on a hard surface. Then you can rotate that image with natural gestures. So, and you can also use that to create an anchor line where now you have an axis of rotation. So these are the kinds of ways that we're looking at how to actually navigate an image in 3D. So we're getting rid of the paradigm of 2D slices and saying, okay, how would we do this from the beginning? Then, of course, there's different user interface things you can do. So now for window and level, which is brightness and contrast if you're not familiar, you can actually just have this map that you're navigating. And then we also introduce the ability to have multiple image slices, but now they're fully flexibly moved, just like the other plane. So you can find really descriptive views that are more easily understood. So there's some very obvious applications for 3D modeling in virtual reality. And so here's just an example of doing a quick image threshold to get a model of the spine. And then right away, you can start looking at it and finding, okay, if I was a radiologist who's preparing this for a surgeon, what parts do I want to include or not include? And in a moment, the user starts painting a 3D mask that's basically revealing parts of this model as he goes. And so what we find exciting about this is that it really ties into a paper that was published in The Lancet called The Physician as Artist. And it kind of ties into the theme of this whole day, where we're talking about AI that's offloading all this work, and it leaves new roles for people to do, or ways to better improve their care. And so one of the visions that we have is that radiologists will actually be spending more time on these new frontiers of communication, so that they can, rather than looking at images and finding out what's wrong with them, they get the assistance from AI, and then they have this to communicate their findings more easily. So that's 2D, that's 3D modeling, but the problem with that is that you can't see the reference image while you're changing the model. And so we were working on ways to do 2.5D modeling. So here, just with 2 contours, the user can create a very reasonably close model of the descending aorta. So in a second, it's just gonna pop in as green, and then they'll reveal the 3D object that's been made with just those 2 pieces of input. And the point of this is that you can have, even with no automation at all, you can have some very quick workflows that are leveraged by this new way of looking at images. And so there's a very small edit that happens here, and then it translates in 3D to the change that's happening. So that's basically it. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Justin. We'll hold the questions till the end and go ahead and put them up there, and we'll take them with the microphones again at the end. So next up is Andras Lasso. He's Associate Director of the Laboratory for Percutaneous Surgery at Queen's University, and prior to that was at GE. So Andras?
I've been working in the medical software research and development field for almost 2 decades, and for most time I considered virtual reality as an interesting technology that has nothing really, not really useful or directly applicable in our field. But about 5 years ago, when new virtual reality devices started to come out, and I had a chance to play with them more and more, I realized that actually it may be a big deal, and it should be possible to find important applications in clinical imaging. So what things changed my mind? Basically 2 key features. One is that modern virtual reality systems have immersive display. So compared to working on a desktop where you have a small window, let's say 20-inch diameter window, to look at a 3D structure. In virtual reality, you are in the same space as the 3D model that you are interested in. So you can interact in a much more like wider space, and also you get stereo visualization. So you see distances, see things in 3D, and also your head is tracked, so you can move around these 3D models, you can look behind, so you have a very good impression of what is the shape of that object. So I see that, for example, for 3D printing, you can experience that the same shape that you have difficulty in understanding by just looking at the 2D monitor and rotating around with the mouse. If you 3D print it and hold it in your hand, then you immediately understand the shape. So I had similar experience with models in virtual reality, that you can grab a model, look around it, you can go closer, you can look behind, rotate it. So you have the same kind of user interaction as you would have with real physical objects. So the other key feature is natural 3D interaction. Not just the headset is tracked, but also you have typically 2 hand controllers that has touchpads and joysticks and various buttons on it, and those are all tracked in 3 dimensions. So you can reach out for objects, grab them, align them. So I don't know if you have tried manually registering objects in 3 dimensions on a 2D screen. It's really hard because you rotate it, then it looks well aligned, and then you rotate the view, you realize that it's not well. So it's an iterative, very difficult process. While in the physical world, you can grab 2 objects and just put them together. We practice it every day, all day. So virtual reality and current controllers can leverage all these skills that we gathered, and you can act naturally with virtual environments in current virtual reality systems. And it's very important that these systems are now available. If 10 years ago, if you wanted to have virtual reality systems with immersive display, then you had to pay about 1,000 times more than now. So you can have now a headset for a couple of $100. Maybe you need to buy a computer for $1,000. But overall, anybody who is interested in can afford to buy this hardware, and you can go to a store and you can buy it anytime. So these are highly available. There are mainly two options how to for hardware. One is that you can have a computer-based system. You get a VR-ready computer, which is basically most of the desktop computers today, or gaming laptops, and you can buy a headset for about $500. Or there are now more and more capable standalone VR systems that basically have a smartphone built into a headset, have built-in tracking, and those are less capable, a bit slower, maybe a bit heavier, but they are catching up, and probably within a couple of years, most of the headsets will be mostly wireless and standalone, and you don't need a cable or connection to a computer anymore. So since these current virtual reality systems mainly driven by the hardware development is mainly driven by gaming applications. So and the hardware is like widely available. What about software? So there are game engines that are used to develop games. So when you develop a new computer game, you don't start from scratch, but you start from the software platforms, and they provide many useful features that makes application development easy. Typically, they create a fully immersive applications that you step into that virtual world and you do everything within that environment. They provide useful features like real-time photorealistic rendering with nice lighting, shadows, and also provide physics engine, which allows you to model interactions between objects in a realistic way. And since the gaming industry is huge, the number of developers is in the magnitude of hundreds of thousands. But there is an issue that these engines, these software platforms are made by game developers for game developers. So if the system that you want to build can be formulated as a game or similar style as a video game, then you get most of the features readily usable, and you don't have a lot of work to do. However, if you build a medical software, clinical software, then it often doesn't look like a game. The activities that you do is mainly like loading some studies, looking at some data, querying data from a PACS, just like regular using mouse and keyboard interaction. And you are performing a complex workflow, which may have some 3D components, may have some segmentation or understanding an image in 3D, but most of the time you do like simple stuff that doesn't. It's not really easier in a virtual environment. So if you want to build a virtual reality features into a workflow like this, then there's another approach is to use existing application frameworks and improve them to have virtual reality capabilities. And then you can utilize all the medical image processing and analysis visualization features that have been built over the decades. And also you work in a community that is interested in doing what you are doing. In a gaming development, maybe there are hundreds of thousands of developers. Maybe a few thousand is interested in some special features related to medical imaging. Probably the engine developers will not spend too much time with fulfilling your needs. But if you are working in a community where everybody is aligned in their goals, then you can get much more help, or you can collaborate more easily. In our lab, we use the 3D slicer medical image visualization analysis platform a lot. It's a free open source software without any restrictions. It's used for research and also for product development as a platform for various products. So we've been using this and knowing this well, developing extensions for it. So it was a natural choice for us to see, can we extend 3D slicer to be able to add virtual reality features to it. So like 3D slicer, there are many platforms that try to have the same goals, but slicer is probably the largest or longest living among them all. So this development started more than 20 years ago. Overall, about $50 million of funding went into it. More than 500,000 downloads happened so far, and download counts and user community grows about 20% per year in the last 5 years. So it's continuously growing and still can keep the users' interest. Hundreds of people developed slicer core, and now we have more than 150 extensions in the Slicer App Store, which is a very special app store because all the apps are free. So it's not a financially successful store, but somewhere where you can use to easily share whatever you want to share with others and make it accessible to others easily. And it is used all over the world. In most countries, we have downloads from everywhere. And the figure in the bottom left is shows how the source code changes. So all the flashes are like code changes, and it shows how the software evolved during the last 10 years. There are tools in 3D Slicer for everything. So if you can imagine any kind of visualization or kind of medical data analysis, there are probably others who have worked on that and developed tools for that and shared that. So there is a lot to utilize. And as you can see, there is one Slicer VR extension there that we added that enables combining virtual reality with all the other tools. So we had a Slicer RT radiation therapy extension before that allowed us to import DICOM radiation therapy objects and visualize them and so on. Now you install Slicer VR extension as well. You can see all those radiation therapy plans in virtual reality. You can modify them. So it really combines all the capabilities now with virtual reality. So the goals our goals were to be open and hackable, so keep the open mindset of 3D Slicer, and just add the possibility to try use all these existing features with virtual reality. And we would like to facilitate research and also translation to clinic, and also enable collaboration between users. What was interesting that we didn't need to add many features for Slicer VR to be usable. So basically we just had to add possibility to move around in the scene, manipulate the words. So with the usual, like similarly as you use on your phone, the pinch effect to or gesture to zoom or rotate or translate, we implemented the same effect with two controllers in the virtual space. So you can rotate and scale and move the word around using your two hands, and also you can grab objects and position them. So only by adding these few features and combining all the existing tools in Slicer, we could achieve very interesting results. So this is an example of a pedicle screw insertion using Slicer's volume rendering features with a slice display. You can grab the screw and you can see if it can fit well in the pedicle. You can inspect it by moving around your head to change your viewpoint, or you can grab the word and rotate it around. And for this, we just had to configure the existing features in Slicer, and the result was this quite unique and experience to be able to evaluate how the screws could be inserted. The important side effect is that you have a desktop application that is fully functional, so you can work at the same time on your desktop and in virtual reality. So you can put on your headset, have a look at something in 3D, then just flip it up and work with your mouse, load some more data, do some analysis that is easier to do with the mouse, and then you can go back to virtual reality, just putting back the headset and working like that. And Slicer has communication protocol to synchronize all data through network with other devices, receive real-time information from various tracking devices, and so on. And the same protocol can be used to exchange data with other instances of other Slicer instances. So we use this to set up a collaborative virtual reality experience. So now two people using two different headsets operate in the same scene, so they can see each other and manipulate the same objects. And this is just another demonstration of how you can get a new feature without explicitly implementing a new feature in a virtual reality application, just by leveraging all the existing features. You can try it by downloading Slicer, downloading the Slicer virtual reality extension, and then start playing with this. And I brought a VR laptop and a headset with me, so after this session or in the break, I can give it a try. I can show it if you are interested. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andras. So 2 talks on VR. Next, we're going to hear about Sarah Naheed, who's from FingerFood Technologies, and a mixture of AR and VR applications to improve productivity, well-being, and communication.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time. My talk will be a little bit different, I think, from the rest of the speakers, because it's very heavily focused on actually how these technologies can help humans with productivity, communication, and well-being. I take a different approach in terms of how I view this as more about the business application things, if that makes any sense. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background of our company. FingerFood Advanced Technology Group was established in 2009. Ever since then, we have created the world's industry-first solutions across various industries. As you saw when my presentation started, there was a quote of Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. They speak very highly of us, and that is because we have delivered on innovation. A lot of stuff that you see are proof of concepts or prototypes, but a lot of stuff that we're actually creating are innovation in innovation in action, innovation realized. So in terms of our practice in healthcare, we have clients that I'm going to go through, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, hospitals, we've helped health insurance companies, and I think we leverage our experience from various industries. Let's say our gaming industry, that's a very strong suit. We've all come from gaming background, into creating things that would help users with being more entrenched and immersed in the experiences that we create. We have 3 locations in Canada. We have what we call the holodeck. We have trademarked that. It's 25,000 square foot, and you walk in, you'll see humanoid robots, you'll see pet robots. It's kind of from the future. We have a headquarter, in these 2 are both in Vancouver, and we have a Calgary office. It's called Center for Advanced Technology, and there's trainings offered by Microsoft and Google and other companies in our studios there, and we have an office in Denver, hoping to open an office in Toronto by the end of this year. The kind of technologies we work with is not only virtual and augmented realities, but as I mentioned about the robots earlier, we work with robotics, machine learning, machine vision. We have an IoT design shop. We work with blockchain and AR, VR. But I think our strongest suit is that we actually can combine these different technologies. So we recently created something in retail that had an element of robotic and augmented reality. It was a robot that would go around an object and would take that physical object into augmented reality, fully automated. The process is called photogrammetry, but the photogrammetry rig that we created was fully automated. So now to the topic of augmented and virtual reality and the applications I was talking about. These are all the solutions that we've created for clients across industries, and I just find them exciting. So I want to give you a little bit of overview of some of these applications. So the picture on the left that you see top left, I guess my top left, which probably is your top left too, is for the PACCAR truck. They're one of the largest manufacturers of trucks, and for the longest time, they used to build trucks using clay. Like the design approval process used to be done with clay. At one point, Volvo hoarded the whole world's supply of clay. So PACCAR was in a pinch, and they came to us, and they're like, is there a custom advanced technology solution we can create for this? So we were in the Microsoft HoloLens Readiness Program, and we created our augmented reality tool where you just put on your headpiece, and you can go through 27 designs. You can even overlay aerodynamics data, so you can actually see which design will give you better fuel efficiency, which for a company of size of PACCAR is really important. And you'll see why I say that, because it is related to healthcare. I'm going to talk about a practice later that kind of reminds me of that. It's not that, but it reminds me of that, of how the parallels are obvious. Another solution you'll see there is for Enbridge, for pipeline integrity. So they now can see where the pipelines are actually bending. They can go look inside a pipeline. This is all by putting the data all in augmented reality, so they can actually see when the situation is being risky. For Providence Healthcare, and I'm going to talk about that later, we created a workflow planning, so I'm going to go more in detail about that one. For Deschutes Brewery, we created something for facility management. So you could actually see your equipment, like you could be in your office and you could see your facility remotely and talk to somebody in the facility remotely and look at the machinery that's down or is being risky. For Pfizer, we created a tool for space design. So that's another one I'm going to talk about later, and how they improve the communication. Stryker, I'm going to talk about later as well. And for Lowe's, we created several, but one was the kitchen design tool. So you could actually put their catalog inside your kitchen and see which would fit your kitchen best. For people like me, I think it's actually really helpful, because thinking 3D for me is sometimes hard. So now let's go into healthcare specific examples that the company have worked on or have seen. Space design, workflow planning, engagement of physicians and patients, or vendors and physicians, or staff in general, like frontline staffs, and donors for hospitals, for example, as well as the mental well-being. First example I'm going to talk about is space design. This is the clay example I was talking to you about. So after talking to several major hospitals in Toronto and Vancouver and basically across Canada, I've realized the space planning currently is being done with cardboard mock-ups, and the whole process takes months. And people literally move cardboards around, and imagine this is a bed, imagine this is, so they have to imagine the whole time. And so imagine a scenario when you actually can use augmented reality to speak the same language. So a physician can talk about their workflow, or an electrician can talk about why something cannot be in a specific wall because of the panel that's behind it, or everybody can speak the same language if you can actually put that data. An architecture can talk about how this building should be designed. Everybody can speak the same language. They all can speak and talk in 3D, and that's regardless of their occupation or the specifics that they want to highlight. Second one is workflow planning. So this is something we did for Providence Healthcare in British Columbia. It was a high acuity unit, and nurses wanted to see if they can actually practice their workflows in that space. But you can also think about like heavy equipments like MRI machines. So how do you know where to place them, or hauling the whole equipment is hard, right? So the nurses asked us to create this augmented reality tool where they gave us all their equipment, all the measurements, and we helped them see if their workflow fits in that space that they had. Another is for engagement. So I talked about engagement in different contexts. So this was a vendor-physician engagement. The vendor was Stryker, one of the world's largest medical device companies. They wanted to tell the physicians what their equipments were capable of, and they thought that physicians' time, as you know, is valuable. You can't bring the physicians to show them what you have. You can't try to book appointments with them. So they basically created this tool that they can showcase every capability of that equipment, that the physician can even go around this augmented reality tool and interact with that device to see what's capable of. For Pfizer, they wanted to engage their staff because they're moving from New Jersey to Manhattan, and they wanted to showcase why this is important. They wanted to highlight the strategic plan. They wanted to show their proximity to the bus station or metro. And if you think about it, in a hospital environment, for example, this is an important donor. It could be an important donor engagement tool where you can show them where their name goes, what the money goes towards. There's so many creative ways that you can use this. The last one I'm going to talk about is mental well-being, and that's virtual realities for Lululemon. This is being studied right now by one of the world's most respected hospitals. I can't talk about which one because it's confidentiality, but we created a tool for Lululemon that looks at the heart rate variability and relates that to the scenes you're seeing in virtual reality. So your breath and your mindfulness meditation would be controlled by your breath and basically your heart rate variability. They're all connected. So you can see how this can be used for either a kid that's going to go through a really stressful surgery, or a patient that's going to go through a stressful situation, or for educating that person, or if a physician is having a really hard day, then that day, like, they can just do a mindful meditation practice and relax. Other interesting use cases that I'm seeing in healthcare, one has to do with training. We've been talking to some medical directors, and they think some of the procedures, even though they're basic, they should be second nature. And I can give parallels from other industry. We're doing it in the correctional division. And I know medical practice is different, but if there's lessons that we can all learn. So they are making sure the prison guards know all the different protocols, so it becomes second nature for them when the actual situation arises. And if nurses and physicians are always on top of these protocols, I think that could be good for our healthcare system. Digital surgery, as some of these folks were the expert on that, I'm not going to comment on that, but it's something that augmented reality is being explored at. Remote facility and data management, this is something that I'm getting a parallel from the brewery example I gave you. It's the same thing. You can do this facility management using that. Indoor navigation, other apps. This is when you go in a hospital, it's often you get lost where you should go. And imagine an app that not only gives you that with augmented reality because it's more immersive. Let's say if a kid is looking at it, it shows a rabbit running down the hall, and it can chase it. Or if you're an adult, you can see, arrows and where to go. And that tool could be integrated with the, health information systems where you're checking and the whole systems become more efficient because the staff knows that you've arrived at the hospital or where you're at in your journey. In terms of our process of how we come up with these solutions, we are custom tech. We don't have any products to sell anybody. We just go on board, talk to our clients, and ask about their problems, and we then try to create solutions around it. And that's why we have a process as you can see, called envisioning. And that envisioning session is where we actually decide, shall we use virtual reality or shall we use augmented reality? Shall we use the headsets that some of these folks are mentioning? Should we use HoloLens or shall we use Oculus? And it's not only the technical side that's really important, it's also the design. With a lot of these virtual and augmented reality applications, there's an element of dizziness if you don't design them really well. So you can be immersed in the experience, but afterwards you're about to throw up. So it's really important to have that design and technical person in the room and highlight the journey. And lastly, this is just an overview of some of our clients, obviously not all of them because not allowed to disclose them. If you have any questions, you can feel free to directly contact me. This is my contact information.
Thank you, Sarah. So some interesting talks on the applications and in medical field. A couple questions. One toward the top was on what actually is being showed. Is this kind of proof of principle? How much interaction is there between different people within a scenario? One of the benefits of AR is there's multiple people. You can see your real world. They can either be remote or local, and you can interact with them that way. I think Andras showed one slide where there was two people interacting in a virtual environment. But maybe you guys have any comments on the top question about what you're actually showing and the degree of interaction, and whether maybe you see this as kind of a proof of principle and used for select cases, or this is the expectation being widespread adoption. Will this be how a radiologist reads all their films, or will this be select cases that are overly complicated to review with surgeons and with a number of other medical specialists?
So I think that it's definitely a specialist thing at this time. There's no reason to think that we'll get rid of computer screens altogether. Just like we would have multi-platforms for all sorts of things like iPads and computer screens. People are dealing with images in all sorts of different ways. So to be clear, this is the examples that I was showing, and I think this is the same for the second speaker as well, was that you're just loading in regular medical images and you're dealing with patient-specific data.
Yeah, I think both approaches is explored. So one is this approach, and the other is the demo outside, where you prepare interesting cases or like training cases. Maybe you put a lot of effort into create something really nice. So both make sense, and both are being done. We don't know which one will have more impact or will be more successful overall, but all these are done and explored. And you have the option of, yes, just load whatever data you have and look at it in virtual reality. So that's already available.
I think the second question has a few points that are pertinent. People are reluctant to invest in hardware because it's iteratively changing so quickly. By the time things are implemented, the hardware is outdated, there's a new version out. So cost and maintaining it and everything else is a problem. The other barrier is people don't like wearing the headsets. They're awkward, they look strange. Everything's being miniaturized over time as technology improves. But the question was about, can we get rid of the helmet? There are people working on retinal projection, a number of other technologies, but a lot of the challenge becomes, they become very, very personalized for your specific interpupillary distance, focal depth, like a lot of other things, so it becomes challenging unless they're individualized for that specific user. I don't know if you guys have any comments on other technologies to eliminate or minimize the external headwear and apparatus.
I think I can answer some of it. I think the technology is changing very fast, but I think to get rid of the whole helmet, yet it would be a hype if I say yes at this point. Some of the advances that are happening, for example, with HoloLens 2 is like creating a bigger field of view or creating eye tracking, but getting rid of the whole device at this point is still not possible, but it is moving towards it.
I'd like to make one point that there is a benefit to having a headset that many people don't really think about, which is that if you're going to be looking at images where you have to control the lighting conditions, then it can become a great benefit. So for example, radiologists have specific reading rooms with very particularly crafted lighting so that you don't have glare on the screens. And for a hospital that's going to be adopting, say this does become a thing, and then like in 5 or 10 years, people are actually using it to do radiological work, you can actually just bring your light room with you. Specifically with the new mobile headsets that are coming out, you imagine that you're on the beach, you put on a headset, it blocks all the other light out, and so you're basically in your work environment. So there's some benefit to be had there, even though it's a cumbersome form factor.
And I would just add that it's hard to use a headset if you are alone. If you put it on and you don't see anyone else, then and you are kind of alone in that virtual world, then it's hard. But if there are multiple participants in that same virtual room, there is eye contact, you can show things, you can talk to others. Then this putting on a headset, no one sees the other because everybody has his headset on, and also you are not alone. So it's not that bad already with the headsets. But of course, things will improve and will be smaller, and so it will improve. But you have to probably wait a couple of more years before they get smaller or disappear.
Any questions from the audience? One of the other things that was on the board next is about gloves or more natural interactions with things rather than having these controllers with multiple buttons being tracked in real time. There's companies doing that, working on gloves, giving haptic feedback for things like surgical education, medical applications, industrial ones. So when you touch something virtual, you get haptic feedback. It's a very complicated problem. There's 2 companies really that are fairly far ahead in developing those. I don't know if you guys have any comments on maybe the learning curve, how unnatural these are for people. I think a lot of these things, if you're doing them in the learning environment for new users, they have to be intuitive. They have to work right away. They can't be buggy. People get frustrated and quit, particularly in the medical field. People just won't give it a chance if it doesn't work straight away and it's not intuitive. So maybe on the interface aspect, what's being done to make it more intuitive so people are more likely to engage and continue utilizing it.
It's interesting with the hand. So if you think about that, you use tools all the time. So for example, if you just need to paint something with your finger, or you can paint with a paintbrush or pencil, you appreciate like it's better to have good tools, precision tools, and not just use your bare hand. So I think many applications benefit from having a controller with buttons, and you can do more precise manipulations than just with your bare hand. But of course, it depends a lot on what you are trying to simulate or what you are trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say that I think what we're seeing here is that this technology has basically come about because of video games, right? Like we hit a threshold where the displays and the tracking got good enough, and then everyone's like, okay, we can sell video games with this. And now we're seeing people saying, what else can we do with it? And they're basically taking the video game form factor and jerry-rigging it to what we're talking about today. But there's definitely movements towards having more fine-grained input mechanisms. So there's a lot of hand tracking going on. Like one of the mobile headsets is going to be implementing that. But then there's also more specific tools, like Logitech has announced that they're putting out a VR stylus where you can actually like write on a hard surface or draw in 3D space, and they kind of sell it as a VR mouse, right? This is going to be the mouse of the new platform. So I imagine that there's going to be a lot of application-specific tools that come about if this technology really takes off.
Yeah, one question over on the left here.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to compliment the panel on doing such an excellent job. And just a specific question for Dr. Sutherland, and then a more general question from a clinical perspective. And that is, Dr. Sutherland, your users currently, are they using 3D printing to assist in therapeutic planning or teaching models at this time? And then I guess the more general question with respect to the headsets that you were discussing, do you find clinical users that develop any sort of motion type sickness or vertigo? And do you perceive any repetitive stress injury risks, especially with head and neck movement using these technologies?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So our hospital has a pretty robust 3D printing program that's completely separate from our virtual reality applications. So like we regularly print models to help surgeons and also we print ones that are used for interventions. So our particular focus with some of the work that I displayed today was about helping the people that are at the very beginning of that process. So if you make a model and you give it to a surgeon, he's the one that's benefiting from that new rich form of communication. Can we come up with a way that benefits the first person in that workflow? And so that was that work to do with increasing the ability to do modeling in virtual reality. The second question, I think the vertigo and the sense of dizziness is often because of a mismatch between the motion of your head and the virtual environment. So if you imagine you're in a VR roller coaster, you're actually sitting still, but your eyes are telling you that you're falling down a hill, that immediately causes nausea in people. In terms of comfort and stress and that kind of thing, I think the heaviness of the headsets can be a bit taxing at times. Like you can work for about an hour and then it becomes a bit much. The most obvious one at the moment is probably just the being hot and sweaty. But as the headsets are being further designed with better iterations, they become lighter, they're putting venting into them. So like basically the people that are coming up with this technology want people to be able to be in there for hours. So they're working on it for sure.
One of the other questions was about AR particularly, but also VR for industrial applications is fairly far ahead of healthcare. There's a lot of walkthrough videos where you'll have a virtual overlay. The example in the question was of a mechanic teaching a new mechanic the steps. A number of manufacturers have implemented these types of tools, and whether anything exists in the healthcare setting. And I think there's some early groups working on that that I've seen. Our group is working toward that as well. It's a challenging environment because things aren't manufactured homogeneous, no uniformity between patients. So there's a lot of additional challenges. But that's one of the goals of our group is developing these tools to help people learn difficult surgical procedures, learn the anatomy, walk through it in virtual terms, and then in the absence of any haptic feedback now in the virtual or augmented world, is focus on that when they get to the operating room to be able to do the procedure, focus on the haptic feedback, the amount of force it takes to do certain procedures, because they've walked through all the steps before, they've rehearsed the virtual surgery multiple times previously. So that's the type of thing people are working toward, but it's a complicated process compared to like a manufactured product that's homogeneous across every model that comes out. It's the same.
Do you mind if I add to
Yeah,
that
go
point?
ahead, Justin.
So going from that point, there's something that really ties into an earlier theme of this morning, where we were talking about AI assisting humans and then basically working collaboratively together. So when you're talking about an intervention that's assisted by some augmented reality visualization, there's that challenge of not being able to perfectly know where it is that the patient is versus some sort of manufacturing step. So there's an enormous benefit that could be gained from AI in that step, where basically you use very intelligent algorithms to figure out how that patient has deformed, what it is that the doctor needs to see in that moment, and then you can display it to them in a fully immersive or virtual environment that has their own perspective. And so basically it's like machines are there figuring out what you need to see and then giving it to you. That's the vision that I basically think it'll go to.
I want to echo what he just said. I think if you ask anyone in our company, they would say the same answer. It's about combining these advanced technologies to help with what a human would do, but in a more efficient way. So absolutely, yeah, AI, I think, in AR would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and with that goes a lot of like segmentation tools, automating those. I mean, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they were manually segmented axial slice by axial slice, and just tracing a tool and then having it autofill in 3 dimensions. All of those algorithms have improved dramatically, and a lot of that's artificial intelligence applications overlying the virtual and AR applications. Any additional questions? Okay, thank you very much, guys. Thank you.